Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Annabel Crabb. Coming up, is the government digging a new hole for itself on the mining tax? Oprah puts the O in the Opera House, but will she bring the tourist dollars? And we talk to an MP who's had enough of rude billboards. Our panel tonight, Craig Reucassel, Chaser member and international security hobbyist. Former Liberal federal MP and businessman Ross Cameron. And in Melbourne, Chris Berg from the Institute of Public Affairs. Welcome. Now, it was one of Julia Gillard's first wins as Prime Minister. Open your minds, she asked mining executives, and close off your nasty ad campaign. And a deal was done. But now it seems to be falling apart. The government maintains the new tax will not absorb state-based royalty increases. The miners say, hang on, that wasn't the arrangement. Ex-Strata Coal Chief Executive Peter Freyberg was the latest to vent his frustration to a Senate inquiry last night. But the Treasurer won't be moved.
What I do know is that we signed an agreement with the industry in good faith. We will stick to that agreement in good faith, and I believe that's what the industry wants as well.
What exactly is at stake here? Do these big mining companies have any effective power to stop this tax beyond any other taxpayer that's annoyed about being charged a bit extra?
Well, they have the power that any group of organised citizens in a democracy sort of rightly has. They've demonstrated that they can exercise it pretty effectively. Certainly a significant contribution to the demise of Kevin Rudd was his inability to manage their furious reaction to the government's announcement of a policy without any consultation or discussion. So, Marius Kloppers, the Managing Director of BHP, sort of makes the point that when he enters into a contract with one of his customers, he's expected to honour the deal, whether it's easy or difficult. He expects the government to do the same thing. They appear to be stepping back from the commitment to wipe out the impact of state royalty regimes, partly caused by the fact that we've had newly elected premiers who are saying they don't necessarily buy the deal that was done by their predecessors. So I think this is, I think this deal could unravel, and I think we could see the miners return to the kind of bruising political campaign that humbled the government.
Difficult for them to have the same sort of impact outside of an election campaign, do you think?
Oh, look, I do, but I also think, they were brilliantly effective the last time around. And they made, I think, the association in people's mind between Australian prosperity and the health of the resources sector. And it's a powerful connection for everyone who's a superannuation invested in any of our major resource-based companies. I think it's not clear to me that the government is going to welch on the deal. They sort of look like they're preparing the ground to. I think it'll be a gutsy move if they do.
It's not exactly as if, though, it's not like a normal situation, though, where the government's kind of ensconced in its cushy governance for the next 3 or 4 years in this situation, because the independents are there. You could still create a lot of damage by a bit of a campaign, particularly in their seats, some of them which have mining. So I can imagine that you'd be able to do a bit more damage than ordinarily, given the situation with independents.
Although, I mean, the key vote here is going to be in the Senate, and after June next year, which you can assume the vote will be pushed out to, because given the joyous advent of a Senate inquiry, that generally seems to cool things down for a little bit of a while. Hard to see this coming to the vote in the Senate before the middle of next year, partially, of course, because the government has scheduled hardly any sitting weeks in the first half of next year, perhaps in an indication of how they expect things to get a little bit easier for them after the middle of the year. And I can't see the Greens knocking this one back.
Look, I think Julia became Prime Minister on the basis that she was going to fix these key problems. And, one was the mining super profits tax and this massive stoush which had engulfed the government and the nation. She said she would fix it. She apparently did a deal that did fix it. If it unravels, I think Julia's case, her legitimacy, if you like, as leader of the Labor Party, as Prime Minister, it takes a bit of a hammering.
Well, look, I'm going to bring Chris Berg in here for a minute, lest he thinks we've forgotten him in the Melbourne bunker. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Annabel. Nobody ever forgets Melbourne. Don't worry about that.
Well, largely due to you, I have no doubt. Look, the mining super profits tax is something that the Gillard government describes as a vital reform item on their agenda. You've written a great piece on The Drum today on the concept of reform and what the term means. And lately in this country, we seem to spend a lot of time demanding tough reform and politicians bicker a lot about who has the more significant and sincere commitment to reform, but how exactly do you define it? Do you think we're suffering from reform confusion on this front?
Well, I think, as you say, reform is one of the strongest words in the Australian political dynamic. If you can cast yourself as a reforming Prime Minister or a reforming government, then, well, you hope to join the pantheon of Australian heroes. So you hope, and John Howard hoped to do this as well, Kevin Rudd hoped to do this. They wanted to join Bob Hawke and Paul Keating as the great reformers. But of course, the real question is, what constitutes reform? Now, in that piece, I was talking about the emissions trading scheme and whether it fits some basic criteria that the Productivity Commission has put out about reform movements. But I think also in this context, we're talking about the mining tax and the changes to the mining system. And the government really wants to talk about it as it's a substantial reform. It's going to change Australia. But essentially, the mining tax is a shift of the taxation over mining royalties from the states to the Commonwealth. So no wonder the Commonwealth thinks it's a really special piece of reform and it's really important. The states think it's awful, which is why you also raised the question of the Senate, of course. The Senate really, at this stage, has to stand up for the rights of the states, which it was supposed to do, and hold back this centralisation, this unfederalisation of royalties in Australia. I think we have to focus on the substance of reforms rather than just talking about is something reform or isn't it reform, and the more we do, the better. I don't understand that idea.
So you think that the mining tax is an example of your reform is my petty theft? How would
exactly.
How do you guys define it? Any ideas?
Look, it's interesting that I read Chris's article about the difference between the various reforms that are going on here, and the suggestion that if reform has to be productive to actually be some kind of reform. I don't think it's necessarily true. I think the ETS is a reform that would be perfect it would be in a way the same political kind of reform as occurred to the banking reforms in the 80s and these kind of things, in that a government can grasp onto it, impress people by holding its, holding up even against those that dislike it, and be seen to actually pull something off and make a change. It's one of those examples.
But it's not as simple. Yeah. It's not as simple as just saying that reform is unpopular, because anything can be unpopular. The argument I'm trying to make with the emissions trading scheme isn't necessarily that the emissions trading scheme is a bad idea. It is of a different form. It is of a different type to the great reforms of the 1980s, which were deliberately productivity enhancing and deliberately designed to boost economic growth. Now, the emissions trading scheme is deliberately designed to hold back certain forms of economic activity and therefore restrain economic growth, at least to a degree.
So
I think we have to distinguish between those two types of reform.
So your reform is kind of deregulatory rather than re-regulatory, in effect, is kind of your
my argument actually comes from the Productivity Commission chairman, which is the government's central economic think tank, effectively. And they would argue, and they have argued, that reform, to be considered reform, has to be productivity enhancing. Now, it has to be a range of other things. It's got to be sustainable. It's got to last for a long time. And with the emissions trading scheme, it's also got to achieve its goals, which I think is a real problem. But we can all redefine what we think reform is. But I'm just saying that we've got to understand that these are two separate types of changes to the Australian economy.
I'm glad, Chris, because you're so thrilled about the Productivity Commission here, that I'm hoping you've also read their other report that says free trade is doing no good for Australia. I'm looking forward to the Institute of Public Affairs being arguing against free trade.
Craig, I've actually read it closer than you have. It suggests that bilateral free trade agreements don't necessarily live up to the promises of the governments that are making them. It says nothing on the benefits of free trade in general, and I think I agree with the Productivity Commission on this one.
Selective attention to the Productivity Commission is a matter of cultural imperative in Australia. Exactly. We have a government that pretends it doesn't even exist every now and again, like when it's working out whether the National Broadband Network is a good idea. Anyway, well, look, moving on. The WikiLeaks document dumps, of course, just keep on coming, and today's insights in the Fairfax newspapers reveal that defence bureaucrats can't add up, and that the Americans didn't think much of former Defence Minister Joel Fitzgibbon. Now, in the next few hours, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is due in a London court, represented by the eminent Australian QC Geoffrey Robertson, who would probably struggle to compose a hypothetical as lurid as his client's current situation. In the UK, a group of activist hackers is warning that British government websites will come under attack after tonight's court appearance. But lawyers for Mr Assange claim the extradition attempt by Sweden is merely a delaying tactic for the US, which has set up, they claim, a secret grand jury in Virginia. Craig, now, you've been an international fugitive and security annoyance. Is this getting a bit out of hand, do you think?
I think it is. I just can't go on before I just put out that I cannot believe Joel Fitzgibbon's sacking is seen as some kind of blessing in disguise. At the time, no one thought it was a blessing in disguise. Everyone thought it was obviously, in favour. I mean, this is the least secret leak to come out of WikiLeaks ever. even the fact that Kevin Rudd was a control freak was more of a secret than the fact that Joel Fitzgibbon everybody wanted him to be sacked. I mean, I'm amazed this has even made it to the newspapers. But that aside, look, I think I have no idea what's happening and whether or not it's better for him to be in the UK or Sweden. I mean, I wouldn't have thought either of those countries were countries that were essentially going to be easy countries to get Assange over to the US if he's going to face trial over there. I mean, the UK has a quite strong legal system and an independent legal system I thought would protect certain rights there. Sweden is not exactly seen as being the underling of America. I mean, they were socialist once, heaven forbid. So it's a bit strange as to where this fits in, and I kind of feel like at the moment that the whole situation is kind of like trying Al Capone for tax evasion. I just would prefer if we could actually, be talking about Assange and, the actual leaks and the legal case against him, rather than it being caught up in all these questions of possible rape trials and extradition and that kind of thing. It's confusing the debate a great deal.
But the extradition question is actually a really interesting one, because the WikiLeaks cables have shedded light on some of the extradition procedures out of Europe and into the United States, where in one case, Spain said that it didn't want to allow somebody to be extradited to the United States because the United States didn't have enough respect for civil liberties and human rights, which of course is an awful reflection on the state of the United States today. But Julian Assange might know what he's getting into because he's read those cables. He knows what they're talking about between Sweden, the UK and the US.
I'm always surprised that we don't hear more from Kevin Rudd on the period of his diplomatic career that he spent in Sweden. We always hear quite a bit about the time that he spent in Beijing, but
he obviously doesn't speak Swedish.
Well, actually, no, that's untrue. I'm assured that his control of the Swedish language is still quite admirable, which is, not impossible to believe, I think, under the circumstances. Now, Ross Cameron, if you wouldn't mind my stretching credibility for a moment and asking you to put yourself into the position of